Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Christina Langell. Christina, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm well. The juvenile justice system in Pennsylvania is objectively broken. The state has about 35 different ways to fix it, and they've only implemented 2 of those ways. So what's going on here?
Well, a lot's going on. So in 2019, going way back, Governor Wolf asked for there to be a Juvenile Justice Task Force to address the longstanding issues in the juvenile justice system. And that task force released their report in 2021. The report had 35 recommendations for how to improve juvenile justice in the state. And actually, Representative Dan Miller, who is leading the charge to do some legislative reform this session, said that if you really break down those 35 recommendations, it's more like 75 recommendations. So it's a lot. And this legislative session, they have a care package that they are introducing that is 10 bills. So add that to last year's 2 bills that made it through, and you have the potential for 12 reforms out of that very large number of recommendations.
So what are some of the big reforms there that they want to see happen this year?
A lot of the reforms are basically making a distinction between children and adults, because historically in the justice system, we have kind of treated juvenile justice as just a child version of the adult justice system. And I think we're seeing more and more that different tactics work better for children than adults, especially, as kids are still developing and still learning consequences and still like learning, basically developing that frontal lobe that's good at decision making. That actually happens until you're 25. So there's a lot of difference between a kid and an adult when it comes to committing a crime. Having said that, the biggest one for some legislators is removing the requirement that causes some specific crimes to automatically go to adult court for anyone who's 15 to 17. That's a big one that Representative Chris Rabb out of Philadelphia has talked about. And he says that legislation goes back to the 90s when we had this idea of a super predator that was, kind of on both sides of the aisle, a pretty big buzzword, and essentially used to put predominantly Black boys into jail at higher rates than the rest of the country. So that's a big one, is taking away the requirement to automatically charge children as adults and prohibiting, for most crimes, charging children as adults and getting them into that adult justice system. Another one is changing the way that they handle Miranda rights, because, if you or I were to get arrested, we hear like, you have the right to remain silent, et cetera, et cetera. If you tell a child that, they don't really understand that. And especially because children are hardwired to listen to adults. If you say, oh, you don't have to say anything, and then you ask them a question anyway, it's very confusing because they're supposed to answer them. So they're talking about changing the way that they talk about Miranda rights to children in a way that allows them to actually use them correctly. They want to avoid putting vulnerable kids into the juvenile detention centers at all, because of the environment that it is. And especially there's one bill that says that students can't be placed into any kind of detention placement that can't adequately provide an education for them. So if you have someone with a 504 plan, someone who has any kind of like intellectual disability or any particular needs, then they shouldn't be in a general detention facility where they can't get the right kind of education for those needs. So that's a big one.
Well, I'm curious, what are the conditions like in some of these facilities? Is it like adult prison, or is it, because I'm trying to wrap my head around, as you've been saying, kids are not just young adults, or little adults. So what kind of conditions are they facing in incarceration?
Some of the facilities are pretty bad. During a press conference about this package, Rep. Krajewski from Philly, he kind of gave a description of visiting one of the detention facilities in his neighborhood and said that he saw 10-year-olds in shackles with no place to sleep. We've heard some pretty bad horror stories coming out of different detention facilities. There was one story that made headlines where guards were basically bribing kids with cheesesteaks to beat each other up, and the kinds of things that you don't like to hear about, but do at least kind of expect to hear about from an adult prison, but not, not what anyone wants to see happening to kids who are supposed to be learning a lesson and rehabilitating to go back out. So for that reason, there's a big emphasis on diversion programs that can help kids within their communities and within their neighborhoods so that they can kind of do this, commit some restitution for what they did and learn the lesson without going into an environment that might actually exacerbate behavioral issues or double down on the kinds of trauma they may have experienced outside of the justice system.
Right. I think it's important to note that not all of the kids that are in in the system have done. I mean, I think when we think of people who are in the system, there is a widespread belief in a knee-jerk reaction. It's like, well, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. But it's a lot more complex with kids. There's a lot of kids, as you mentioned, with 504 plans that might have other kinds of disabilities that have transitioned into behavioral problems, and certainly not going into a hostile environment where violence in that case is even more encouraged and delinquent behavior is even more encouraged. That's not going to help the situation. And so you kind of create this pipeline, this self-fulfilling prophecy of kids who are behavior problems who get sent away and just become bigger behavior problems. So So these bills are really trying to prevent that from happening and try to really rehabilitate the kids who need it and just haven't been getting it for years.
Yeah. And another big thing from that is that a lot of the kids who are there aren't even necessarily there for the crime that they committed. A lot of kids are in detention centers for violations of whatever rules that were put on them when they were initially entered into the system. So like you were saying, not everyone's in there for like, oh, if you don't, don't do the crime if you can't pay the time. Like sometimes it's like, oh, they didn't meet up with someone when they were supposed to. And that can come down to parental factors and other things like that. In fact, one of the bills is about getting rid of court fees and fines put on children because they'll fine you just like an adult, even though children don't have jobs. That ultimately falls on the parent. But if you're coming from a low income household and your kid gets fined $15,000, there's a very good chance that that's going to really hurt you financially. You're not going to be able to pay it. And your kid will go back to detention because they've violated for not paying the fine.
Right. That's a very good point. And that's probably something that happens a lot more often than people would realize. So it's bipartisan though, but it doesn't sound like, these recommendations have been around for a while. So is there any hope that we'll get some of these this year?
Yeah, the recommendations were from a bipartisan task force. So it should be a bipartisan effort. The people who are all involved in the bills currently who were part of the press conference announcing it, those are all Democratic representatives. But I do think that there is, like I said, there's an appetite for reform on both sides of the aisle. And that's something I'm going to be looking into and digging into further because I know even some of the conservative policymakers like the Commonwealth Foundation are really interested in juvenile justice reform. So I think that there are signs that it could be possible. But again, with the Pennsylvania legislature, you always have to just wait and see because sometimes it really just comes down to whether or not they're willing to bring something to a vote. And for political reasons, they may not.
Right, right. All right, Christina. Well, we'll be following your stories at thecentersquare.com as you report on this. Thanks for joining us today.